the Battle of Shiloh. In one sense, it had solved nothing except to keep the coffin makers busy. Everywhere, the sights and the smells of blood and death, with upwards of 25,000 casualties, to set the stage for things to come. In the Civil War era, when people spoke of the Battle of Shiloh, it was with a kind of awe and reverence, not because it was the worst battle in terms of casualties, but because it was a place of such dark horrors. Gloomy forests cut up with deep ravines and swamps and patched with deadly open farm fields, and slain bodies piled high upon each other. Everywhere, the sights and the smells of blood and death mixed with the pungent fragrance of early springtime. General Ulysses S. Grant wrote afterward that there were so many killed, a man could walk across a huge cotton field merely by stepping on dead bodies without his feet ever touching the ground. The place names of the battle had a chilling resonation. The Hornet's Nest, the Sunken Road, the Peach Orchard, Bloody Pond. Before the war, Pittsburgh Landing was a remote hog and cotton steamboat dock on the Tennessee River, but the battle took its name actually from the Shiloh Church, a chink-and-mortar log meeting house, not much better than a respectable Iowa corn crib, but it was a house of God. And ironically, in Hebrew, its name means place of peace. One of the significant things about Shiloh, and there are many, is that it was so utterly shocking to the nation, to both nations as it were at the time. For the first time, it showed Americans on both sides that the war would not be over by Christmas, as the common saying went. It showed that there was no dainty or shrewd military maneuver that was going to put an end to the conflict. Instead, people began to realize that by starting a civil war, they had unleashed a vast monstrosity, a sort of long-term corpse factory that was going to drench the country in blood for years to come. After the Battle of Bull Run, the only other battle so far in the war, people were horrified at 5,000 casualties at Bull Run. Then came Shiloh with upwards of 25,000 casualties and set the stage for things to come. Tactics and strategy in the Civil War had not kept up with advances in weaponry. There's an old military maxim that says generals always fight the last war, which is quite true during the first years of the American Civil War. Military textbooks of the day preached Napoleonic tactics that were 50 years outmoded, that called for armies to march with the most men to the sound of the guns. Mostly, they marched to the slaughterhouse. In early 1862, the war was scarcely a year old. Troops were green, some perhaps had some state militia training. A few had fought in the Mexican War 15 years earlier. Most Union generals seemed afraid to attack the rebels. They seemed afraid for their reputations. All that is except Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was from Illinois, where his father kept a tannery and a slaughterhouse, and from a young age, Grant was revolted by the sight of blood. At West Point, he was an indifferent student, and when he entered the service, it was in the Quartermaster Corps, hardly a conspicuous branch of the service. But during the Mexican War, Grant stood out and distinguished himself for his personal bravery in battle. But afterward, At a series of Army posts in California, Grant gained a reputation as a drunkard, and ultimately he was forced to resign from the service. In civilian life, he continued to fail. He failed as a farmer, he failed as a businessman. Finally, he took a job as a last resort in his father's leather goods store in Illinois, which was where war found him. He was given a job at first training state troops. More explicitly, he was asked to take over a regiment of volunteers who were described by the governor as a mob of chicken thieves led by a drunkard. Amazingly, Colonel Grant whipped these miscreants into shape and was given more regiments, which formed a brigade, and he became a brigadier general. He soon distinguished himself by taking a small army to capture the rebel Forts Henry and Fort Donelson on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, respectively, which opened those waterways to Union vessels. And then, using Union gunboats and steam transports, he pushed south until he came to Pittsburgh Landing. Grant's army now consisted of about 50,000 men. His instructions were to wait at Pittsburgh Landing for Union General Don Carlos Buell and his army of 22,000, who were marching overland from Nashville. And when combined, their forces would be irresistible to anything the Confederacy could throw at it. Less than 20 miles south was the Mississippi town of Corinth, where the rebel general Andrew Sidney Johnston had gathered about 45,000 rebel soldiers. As his second in command, Johnston had been sent the delightfully named General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, hero of Manassas and known as the Great Creole. The Confederates knew that if Buell joined Grant, the Union forces would be too strong to conquer. Johnston wanted to wait for another rebel army of 10,000 that was marching its way from Arkansas, but Beauregard urged an immediate attack on Grant, and Johnston agreed. Rain and mass confusion delayed the Confederate attack by 3 days, possibly a fatal error. But somehow, by April 6th, 1862, they managed to sneak this huge rebel army into the woods less than a mile from the Union forward positions. At dawn, the rebel assault began. There were 3 Confederate battle lines, each 2 miles long, a stirring sight, each containing about 10 to 12,000 men. One Yankee soldier said that the rebels looked as if to be on parade. They marched out of the tree line, their bands playing, the drummers drumming, the flags waving, thousands of bayonets glinting in the morning sunlight, officers on horseback, and above all, the chilling rebel yell. Something primal about that rebel yell. Indian, possibly. It was once described as sounding like a pack of 50,000 yelping beagles. But whatever it was so uncanny coming through the woods, it was said to cause a shiver to anyone within earsight. How the Federal Army got surprised has never been satisfactorily explained. Grant's engineer laid out camps with a mind toward sanitation and convenience, like Boy Scouts, rather than for defense. In fact, there were many warnings of a rebel presence, but these were not heeded. General William Tecumseh Sherman actually had one sergeant arrested for promoting false rumors. It was on April the 6th, 1862, a lovely spring morning. Peach orchards and dogwoods were in blossom, and the forest floor was carpeted with violets. In the Union camps, men were finishing breakfast. They were shining shoes or cleaning their rifles, or in some cases attending Sunday services. Many diarists remarked how many birds were singing that morning. There was not a cloud in the sky, but on the horizon it grew darker as the rebel host advanced. In the Confederate lines was 18-year-old Henry Morton Stanley, who one day would become famous as the great African explorer who discovered Dr. Livingstone. At least he ran into him in darkest Africa. Just before the battle, Stanley reached down and picked a handful of violets, tucked them in his hat band. He mused that any Yankee seeing him with flowers in his hair would hesitate to shoot him. Later, Stanley was to say of the so-called glory of war, it was all a glittering lie. There were well-known writers in both armies that day. General Lew Wallace of Indiana was commanding the division under Grant. He would go on to write the most popular novel of the 19th century, Ben-Hur. Ambrose Bierce was a young lieutenant in Buell's army who would one day become among the most popular of the American writers, who would publish among his other works the so-called Devil's Dictionary, which is still in print. And there was Sam Houston, Jr., the son of the man known as the Father of Texas, who recalled it when his regiment marched into the heavy Union fire. Our line actually seemed to wither and curl up. What a remarkable description. At first, the rebel attack was immensely successful. Union divisions were batted back more than a mile and thrown on one another in a fearful slaughter in a matter of minutes. A six-gun Union battery, artillery battery, reported 50 of its gunners were killed and all of its horses, except the reserve. But by late morning, General Grant had reached the battlefield. From the mansion 9 miles downriver, where he had kept his headquarters, afterward, he would receive severe criticism for not staying close to his army. Both flanks of the Federal Army were giving way, but in the center was a deadly pocket of resistance that came to be known as the Hornet's Nest, and near it the sunken road where the rebels expended themselves in attack after attack after attack, only to see their dead heaped in piles before the ferocious Union cannon fire. There was a 9-year-old girl on the battlefield that day. Her name was Elsie Duncan. Her family owned a farm in the vicinity of Pittsburgh Landing. They had been caught in the surprise like everyone else. And Elsie remembered years later in a memoir that the battle began at our front gate and swept through, leaving behind the bodies of dead men and dead horses. By mid-afternoon on April 6th, General Johnson, commanding the Federate Army, now I got it right, was killed while personally leading a charge against the Hornet's Nest. He had a regiment of Tennesseans who refused to fight. He said, Tennesseans who would not fight, I'll lead them. And he did. Today, it would be unthinkable in military science to take such losses against an enemy strong point. By fire maneuver today, you would simply isolate it, bypass it, leave it to wither. But they weren't using today's tactics. General Johnson on his horse, took a bullet through the back of his knee. He didn't even know he'd been hit, but it severed an artery and he bled to death. The supreme irony was that only a few minutes before he had sent his personal physician away to tend to some Yankee wounded. If his physician had been there, he could have tied that wound off in a few moments, and Johnson would have lived. But General Beauregard now took charge, and the fighting continued. By late that afternoon, the Hornet's Nest had been taken by the rebels, along with an entire Union division and its commander, General Prentiss. At last, as the sun began to set, the Confederate onslaught had cornered what remained of Grant's army with its back to the wall at the landing itself. And the rebels prepared for one last great charge that would end the battle and destroy the Union Army. But this never happened. General Buell had arrived cross the Tennessee River late that afternoon, and his army began crossing on steamboat to supplant the thinned-out ranks of General Grant's force. And as the rebels were gathered for a final charge, they thought would have ended the fight, word came from General Beauregard to cease fire and retire from the firing line. Unfortunately for the Southern force, this new Confederate commander had remained at Shiloh Church, 2 miles away from the present fighting. He had sent a telegram that afternoon to Jefferson Davis in Richmond saying, "The day is ours." Premature? Yeah. Beauregard felt that there had been success enough that day and he could easily finish off Grant in the morning. Imagine his surprise. Next day, word got back that Grant had been reinforced with 20,000 fresh men on the field. Beauregard, with his own losses, could scarcely count that many men in his entire army at that point. All morning, the fresh Yankee army pushed back the rebels, first to their original lines and then beyond. About 2 p.m., one of Beauregard's aides suggested that they might best call it a day, and the great Creole agreed, replying, "I intend to withdraw within 10 minutes' time." Thus ended the Battle of Shiloh. In one sense, it had solved nothing except to keep the coffin makers busy. There was no triumphal surrender, no capture or destruction of the rebel army. But Grant still held his field, minus about 12,000 casualties, and Beauregard staggered back to Corinth with about the same number of killed, wounded, and captured. Grant had escaped destruction by a very narrow margin. And it was his own fault for not fortifying, for not patrolling to the south, where the enemy was known to reside. On the other hand, Grant's tenacity saved the Union a deep embarrassment, if not a catastrophe. If Grant had been forced to surrender, there was little between the Confederate Army and the great cities of the Midwest, Chicago, Cincinnati, even Cleveland. The state of Kentucky almost certainly would have been lost to the Union, and probably Missouri as well, a calamity. Lincoln would have been forced to pull his armies out of Virginia at the worst possible moment. And so Lincoln and the nation had Grant to thank that did not happen. But when the casualty figures from Shiloh became known, great scorn and shame was heaped on Grant by the press and by the politicians. While rumors spread that Union soldiers had been so surprised they were bayoneted to death in their tents, in their sleep, everyone was calling for Grant's head on the false rumor that he had been drunk during the battle. Apocryphally, Lincoln is supposed to have replied, "If Grant was drunk, find out what kind of whiskey he drinks and send a barrel to the rest of my generals." If there is no proof that Lincoln actually said that, there is evidence, and I've seen it, that he confronted Grant's detractors with these words: "I can't spare that man. He fights." With the battle over, Grant went on to greater things at Vicksburg and then east to take command of all the Federal armies and to face Robert E. Lee in Virginia. Grant himself had been one of those to believe that the war would be short, and one great battle would decide it. Shiloh changed his mind. After that, Grant concluded that the war would not be won until the entire South was, in his words, subjugated or totally crushed. And that informed Grant's future tactics and strategy, most especially the fearful slaughter in Virginia. In 1864, it had become at last a war of attrition. So there you have it, the Battle of Shiloh. And if there is any overarching significance to that battle, I think it might be this. that once again it demonstrates that Americans are an exceptional people, that they are willing to fight and to die if necessary for ideas rather than for conquest of territory, and for ideals rather than pillage and plunder. An exceptional distinction by any measure. Thank you.